Good morning. It's Neil Midlane here I'm the Group Sustainability Manager for Wilderness Safaris. And this morning I'm chatting to Dr. Peter Lindsey, who is the Director of the Lion Recovery Fund, a conservation nonprofit based out of San Francisco in the United States. Morning, Pete.
Morning, Neil. How are you doing?
Yeah, we're doing okay, thank you, in these very interesting times.
Yeah, for sure. Not an easy time, eh?
So I'm sitting in Cape Town and Pete is sitting in Harare in Zimbabwe. Pete and I have had a professional and personal friendship relationship for a number of years now. So it's nice to catch up and see that you're doing well up there, Pete, and that you guys are safe and happy in Harare.
Yeah, we're surviving so far. Zimbabwe's been really lightly touched by the COVID crisis so far, so we're hoping that it stays like that.
Great. Pete, I just wanted to have a bit of a catch up. We haven't spoken in a while, and there's a lot of interest at the moment in conservation in particular and the impact that COVID-19 is having on conservation and wildlife in Africa. But I wanted to chat to you particularly around lions, and I guess amongst all the awareness we have around the world about species under threat, we hear often about elephants and rhinos, and more recently about pangolins. They're very much in the news with the COVID issue, but we seldom hear about lions. So what is the conservation status of lions, and how has the species fared over the last 20 years in terms of numbers?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Lions are struggling. In many senses, they're an indicator of the pressures facing African savannas more broadly. So over the last 20 to 25 years or so, numbers have declined by about half. The exact numbers these days are not known with any great accuracy, but the best estimates are somewhere in between 20 and 25,000, and definitely declining on a continental level. The species is listed as vulnerable as a whole, but the West African subspecies is considered to be critically endangered.
It's quite an indictment on a species that receives so much publicity and is such an iconic animal and revered around the world, that we've let it get to this stage.
Yeah, Neil, I think you're one of the conservation status of lions, I think, even caught we conservationists by surprise. Perhaps about 10 years ago, we suddenly woke up and realized that there was a real problem with lion conservation. That's us as conservationists. And the general public at large, I think, still hasn't quite caught on as to how serious the situation is. I think one of the reasons for that is that lions are a very prominent and visible species, and they still occur in good numbers in the main tourism areas. And so they do give the impression of that all is well, but in reality, they're declining in number and shrinking in distribution. They currently occupy just 8% of the historic range, to give you an idea.
Well, that's quite a scary number. And Pete, what would you say from the research that you've done and that others have done? What are the key factors driving the decline in lion numbers?
I would say that the key factors are habitat loss is a big one, obviously. But having said that, there's a lot of habitat in Africa that doesn't have lions. So I don't think that is the primary cause, although of course it's a very serious and somewhat irreversible issue. But the illegal hunting of lions prey for bushmeat is probably I would say the single biggest and most widespread threat. The retaliatory killing of lions through conflict with livestock keepers is also a very significant threat. And then in some parts of the continent, we're starting to see targeted poaching of lions for their body parts. So it's very serious in certain places, but it's across the board. I can't say it's a threat on the level of the bushmeat issue or the conflict issue just yet.
Okay, I'm particularly interested at the moment, I think, with what's happened around COVID and the impact that that's having on communities who live adjacent to protected areas where lions persist. In the human-lion conflict issue that you mentioned, can you tell us a bit more about that and how it manifests and what effects it has on people and lions in these landscapes?
Yeah, okay, so all right, I'll answer those two questions in a sense there, because one is the impact of COVID on conservation, and one is the kind of human-lion conflict issue more broadly. So the human-lion conflict is a very serious issue for rural communities, many of whom depend upon livestock for their livelihood. And so if lions are to kill one or a number of cattle, it can have a very, very profound impact on the well-being of that family for the course of a year. So unsurprisingly, people tend to react fairly strongly to this. Even if it hasn't happened, they often react kind of preemptively and try and destroy lions to prevent that risk, which is unfortunate but understandable. What is fortunate with the human-lion conflict issue is that there are a number of techniques that we know actually work quite well in terms of preventing conflict, and so communities are often very open to partnerships and working together to resolve human-lion conflict, and we can go into some of those steps are at some stage. Regarding the COVID issue, so I guess the viewers or listeners have heard a lot about the impact of COVID on conservation. It has been a bit in the news, but the way I see it, there's three primary issues. One is that the COVID crisis is going to result in a reduction in funding for conservation agencies because of the collapse of the tourism industry and because of the market volatility and the economic decline that we're seeing around the world. So there's less donor funding available. Secondly, some of these lockdowns are imposing limitations on the ability of wildlife agencies to act in the field. And then thirdly, the lockdowns are creating economic hardship, which is increasing poverty and food security, and also in some places resulting in an influx of people from urban areas to their rural homes, which is putting a kind of greater juxtaposition between people and wildlife. So all of these things together create a little bit of a perfect storm for wildlife conservation, where you have more threats and less capacity and funding to deal with them.
Yeah, I think being in the tourism industry, I think we're seeing that very clearly, and I think we're particularly concerned about the people who rely on our industry for their livelihoods and the effect that this pandemic has had on those people, because many of them have lost all their income. As an industry, we've spent decades building support for conservation and wildlife through demonstrating to rural communities that they can benefit from these wildlife assets. And so as these benefits shrink, we're seeing a likely reduction in the tolerance for wildlife from these people. So we're possibly expecting that human-lion conflict may be increasing or spiking during this period. Do you think that's a reasonable expectation?
I think it's possible, Neil. I do think it's possible. I know in some landscapes there's been restrictions on the movement of livestock and on the sale of livestock and so forth, which have had implications for conflict. I do think, as you say, there might be lower tolerance because of the lack of benefits. But in addition to conflict, I think there's a perhaps even more serious risk of elevated poaching of wildlife for meat, to help people through the hardship. So we can expect all of these threats to become more serious, I think, during this period. And so let's just hope the COVID crisis disappears as fast as it arose. Yeah.
So we, as Wilderness, we operate a number of concessions in very different landscapes across the continent. And in some of these areas, human-lion conflict is quite a significant issue. If I think in particular of northern Namibia, where we work very closely with the Desert Lion Project. We look at the Okavango Delta, just on the northern edges of the Delta, and then in southeastern Wangi National Park in Zimbabwe, there's quite often conflict with communities outside the park there. Do you see any similarities between these areas in terms of the challenge they face with lions?
Yes, absolutely. So all three of them have human-lion conflict. The Okavango and Wangi also have bushmeat poaching challenges as well. I think it's important to note that all three areas are spectacular wildlife areas that retain an abundance of wildlife. They're very special places, and the fact that wilderness is ensconced in these critical lion areas is one of the primary reasons why we partner with you guys, which is something I think we'll come to a bit later. Sure. But yeah, Neil, so the human-lion conflict is an issue that's common to all three of them. And so, as you know, the Lion Recovery Fund, facilitated through the partnership with Wilderness, is supporting efforts to tackle human-lion conflict in all three of those sites.
Yeah, so maybe you can give our viewers a little bit of an insight into what sort of mechanisms or tools are available for practitioners who are trying to reduce and mitigate these conflict issues. What are we doing in the field to help them?
Yeah, so over the last few years, there's been a great deal of expertise that's been built up around the issue of conflict mitigation for lions. The Lion Guardians group in Kenya, Kenyan registered NGOs, actually really had a key role in this. They've developed a suite of interventions that have essentially been modified and applied around the continent. So I think a lot of credit's due to them. But certain common elements of the human lion mitigation efforts involve hiring local people who are affected by conflict to work as liaisons or lion guardians, as they're called in Kenya, or lion rangers, or there's lots of different words for them. But essentially, that they work with the conservation sector and the communities, and their roles are typically to educate communities about how to better look after their livestock in terms of preventing conflict. They warn communities when lions are near. They console communities when conflict events happen, and they show that there's people care about their situation, and they respond quickly when conflict happens. So it's strengthening cattle kraals and bomas, improving the herding, making sure someone responds to conflict incidences, educating communities about livestock husbandry, and early warning systems for communities, such as by collaring lions in problem areas. And so when the lions come close to the communities, you warn them so that they can make sure they're in control of their livestock. These kind of issues. Another one is helping communities find lost livestock, because when livestock are lost, that's when they're really vulnerable to lions.
Yeah, I mean, those are really interesting, and I like the fact that that through people like yourselves, these tools are being spread around the different areas of the continent. I think often in the conservation world, someone comes up with a great idea in one landscape, and it doesn't necessarily flow to others. One of the ones that I have seen, and as a lion biologist, obviously your sort of lions are my favorite species, and you like to think that your study species or your favorite species is quite smart. But one of the interesting ones I've seen is that simply by putting plastic sheeting up around a boma, lions no longer can figure out that there's cattle inside, and it seems to be really effective in stopping them trying to get access into the bomas.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Another key issue with the bomas is strengthening them to make sure that the cattle don't break out, because the lions do sometimes jump into bomas, but almost more common is that the cattle panic and break the bomas and then run out, and that's when they get caught. But as you say, there are some of these relatively simple techniques, such as the black sheeting, which I think is as important for stopping the lions looking in as it is for stopping the cattle looking out.
Indeed.
And then also strengthening the bomas, for sure.
So in 2018, Wilderness Safaris, we joined up with a number of other leading ecotourism operators in Africa. We joined a partnership with yourselves as Lion Recovery Fund and formed something that we've called the Lionscape Coalition. Can you tell me a little bit more about what made you approach us as an industry to start this initiative?
Well, so the tourism industry is a critical stakeholder in conservation. It's a massive industry across the continent, a significant economic actor. It generates literally millions of jobs across the continent. It generates key revenues for conservation. It creates incentives for governments to continue to set aside big areas of land, and communities and private landowners. The tourism industry, your clientele base, is essentially the biggest self-selected body of African wildlife enthusiasts that exist on Earth. You guys are strategically positioned in all of the critical, or most of the critical landscapes. The industry has a substantial economic might, and so in many senses, and you guys have a very strong personal passion in many cases, but also strong vested interest in ensuring effective conservation outcomes. So your interests and our interests as lion conservationists are very closely aligned. So we decided to develop this partnership, the Lionscape Coalition, as a means of kind of harnessing the power of the tourism industry, pulling all of the different tourism actors together. And the cool thing about the Lionscape Coalition is that you guys are competitors in the business realm, but have come together to work really effectively through this partnership towards lion conservation. And it's a significant, each of the Lionscape Coalition members provides an annual contribution to the Lion Recovery Fund, which is really significant in terms of helping us increase our impact. 100% of those donations get straight to the field. So we're very happy to be part of this partnership.
Yeah, I think As are we, Pete. I think it's been a really interesting space for us to be in, and as an industry, obviously we rely heavily on lions. It's one of the most important species that our guests always want to see when they come on safari, whether they're first time or their 20th safari. People want to see lions. One of the sort of criticisms that sometimes comes across in conservation is a focus on single species, but in the case of lions as an apex predator, they really can be an indicator of the health of an ecosystem. So if you have a lion population that is either sort of at ecological carrying capacity or is growing, it tends to be an indicator of the fact that that system is functional. Is that fair?
Absolutely, yeah. They are indicator species. They're a flagship species, so their charisma enables us to raise funding, more funding than we could if we had a less charismatic species as a focus. And they're also an umbrella species in that for an ecosystem to support a healthy population of lions, the habitat has to be intact, the prey populations have to be intact, and the key threats to wildlife in general have to be under control. As the Lion Recovery Fund, we're very careful not to be too one-eyed about lions. That's really important to us. And the majority of our investments go towards the protection of savanna landscapes, writ large, and also engagement with communities. And those investments benefit all species and not just lions. It's very important to us.
Thanks, Pete. Just the last question. So as I mentioned, our guests always want to see lions on safari. And what are your thoughts on the future of Africa's lions? And what is the biggest sort of need that we face to ensure the long-term survival of the species?
Yeah, so in terms, I think that the reality is that Africa's human population is growing quickly. I think that we are going to face some very challenging decades ahead for Africa's wildlife. I do believe that in the long run, things will get better as human populations stabilize and potentially even eventually decline, as governance improves across the continent, as poverty declines. In the long run, things will get better. And thankfully, lions are a species that can recover very, very quickly. So I think in the long run, we'll be okay, but it's going to get tough in the meantime. There's no doubt about that. So to essentially shepherd Africa's lions through this impending storm, we have to make sure collectively as a global community that sufficient support, financial support for conservation in Africa is rallied. We need orders of magnitude more funding for conservation, that 100%. So there's a number of other issues that need to be sorted out, of course, but that's a principal one. We just need to make sure that we protect enough habitat and enough wildlife through the storm that we can, start to rehabilitate areas when we get through to the other side. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think obviously representing the tourism industry, but with a real passion for lion conservation and conservation in general, I really look forward to us being able to continue playing a part in supporting that recovery and that conservation through these times ahead. And we really hope and that the current issues and challenges that we face will be over in the not too distant future, and our guests can come back and continue to support the important work that people like yourselves are doing in this environment. So thank you very much, Pete. Dr. Peter Lindsey, Executive Director of the Lion Recovery Fund. We really appreciate your time, and we look forward to continuing our very good relationship with you.
Yes, thanks very much, Neil, and thanks to Wilderness Safaris for your support, and to Wilderness Safaris guests, because your visits to Africa really do make a difference. Because the tourism industry, if we can align conservation and development, that's another key step, and make conservation a key driver for development, and tourism is the primary tool for that, the prospects of success are very much greater. So we thank Wilderness and we thank your guests. Please come back as soon as the COVID crisis is over.
Thanks very much, Pete.